Hello, I'm Sam Lichtenstein, Stratfor Director of Global Security Analysts at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, RANE's premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Sign up for the free Worldview newsletter at worldview.stratfor.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast, powered by Stratfor. I'm Emily Donahue. Russia holds parliamentary elections in September, less than a month after Russian telecoms companies blocked Navalny, a mobile app created by Alexei Navalny's inner circle to coordinate opposition votes. What does this mean for the opposition? Matt Orr is here to tell us. He's Stratfor Eurasia analyst at RANE. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, although the topic is pretty significant. All of this is taking place amid the Kremlin's year-long campaign to repress opposition parties and, of course, opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Can you fill us in on the background?
Yeah, Emily, I'd be happy to. I think you really hit it on the head, that the best way to understand these upcoming parliamentary elections is to kind of wind the clock back a year and a half ago. Don't worry, I'll be pretty brief. But basically, about a year and a half ago, Putin started a process to change the Russian constitution and make other changes to kind of prepare the country for his eventual succession. At the end of that process, he had to sneak in an amendment that would annul his previous terms in office so that he could stay in power till 2036. And that, along with the coronavirus pandemic, which eventually came, initiated his approval rating falling to its lowest point ever. Then in Russia, we had the largest regional protests since Putin has been in office in the far eastern region of Khabarovsk. And then finally, we had in neighboring Belarus protests that really came out of nowhere and shocked the Kremlin and made them realize that even way back in 2020, almost exactly a year ago, they realized that in order to prevent these 2021 parliamentary elections from really getting out of hand and posing a serious problem for the Kremlin, that they needed to take preventative measures. And so that was when, in August of last year, we saw the attempted poisoning of Alexei Navalny with a chemical nerve agent, his hospitalization, him having to leave Russia for treatment. That poisoning ended up being really just kind of the start of what's been a year-long campaign against the Russian opposition to prevent something similar to what had happened in Belarus. That crackdown has touched on, obviously, Navalny's organizations first and foremost. Upon his return from Russia, he was imprisoned. In June, his organizations were declared extremist, but it was clear from well beforehand through various legal cases against his supporters that his organizations were going to be on their way out. And this extremism designation that came into force earlier in August, on August 5th, has basically sidelined his organizations and makes their activities essentially criminal, which has prompted Navalny's workers and supporters. Many of them have fled abroad. Many of them have had to give up essentially on kind of public political practice. And to accompany all of that, the Kremlin has also obviously barred candidates, even who are totally unaffiliated with Navalny's organization, from running in this upcoming election. And all of this is because the Kremlin knows that, given the example of 2011, a protest almost exactly a decade ago, that turned out to be the largest protest in the history of Putin's Russia, particularly in the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, that these steps had to be taken, or Russia's political system could begin to see changes that could really get out of control.
So, Matt, with all that said, I assume it's safe to guess the outcome of the elections. What would that mean for Russia's future?
Yeah. The outcome is quite predictable, but just because the outcome is predictable doesn't mean that it's very interesting, doesn't have a lot of ramifications for Russia's future. The ruling United Russia party is certain to retain its majority in the parliament. Really, the only question is whether it retains the constitutional supermajority that it currently holds, which means it would have to hold on to 2/3 of the deputies, which it currently has, which is over 300, or whether it will only retain a simple majority, in which case, if additional constitutional changes are needed, as I'll get into in a second, then they would have to work with some other parties. But that difference is really rather inconsequential, because the opposition parties, the ones that are allowed into parliament, are very, how should I put it, comfortable working with the Kremlin and are essentially subject to the Kremlin's control. But there's a really interesting kind of difficulty for the United Russia Party and for Putin, which is that even government pollsters have fixated the approval rating of United Russia as only somewhere between 25 and 30%, basically at a 13-year low. And so the question is, how do you go about securing 66% of parliamentary seats, or even 50% of parliamentary seats, if your party is only about 30% popular? And the reason lies in Russia's electoral system. So Russia has a mixed electoral system where half of the deputies are determined by party lists and distributed according to a percentage of the vote, and then the other half are based off of single-member districts, where basically the country is divided up into districts, and whoever gets the most in a geographic region gets that seat. And so it's these single-member districts that have been the focus of one of Navalny's organization's biggest initiatives, probably its biggest initiative of the past several years, which is smart voting, which is this idea that all of the opposition parties opposed to the Kremlin should unify behind one candidate to unseat the United Russia person. Of course, the parties aren't willing to take part in this scheme, and so what it means is that Navalny's organization has to go directly to Russian voters and say, okay, no matter how odious this candidate, whether it's a communist or whether it's an ultra-nationalist or whoever, basically whichever candidate we feel has the best opportunity to unseat the ruling party, we endorse them and we think you should vote for them. And so they would provide voting advice all across the country to tell Russians which person they should support in their district to deal the maximum blow to the United Russia Party. And so that was a real threat to the Kremlin. And so that was kind of the electoral trigger, I should say, that served as the reason that the Russian authorities had to take such a big stand against Navalny's smart vote initiative. In terms of why this election is still so important, despite kind of the pre-decided outcome, I think one of the big things to remember is that this is the Duma that will be presiding over Russia in 2024, which is the next presidential election. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, as part of constitutional amendments, Putin annulled his previous terms and received the ability to stay in power till 2036. But in one of the only moments where he explained the justification for that decision, he said that the reason, in his words, he wanted to stop the Russian bureaucracy, like rats, in his words, from looking about and seeing who his successor might be, and instead to focus on their work. If Putin does decide that running in 2024 is something that he doesn't want to do, then this will be the Duma that will have to almost certainly pass all kinds of additional constitutional amendments to actually prepare Russia for succession. The amendments that we saw previously were really just a disguise to nullify Putin's terms. Now, this Duma would have to finalize what was started in 2020 and actually create the framework for the post-Putin Russia. So a lot of pressure will be on them if that's the scenario we're headed for.
So let's talk about Russia's relations with the outside world, particularly the West. What will these election results mean for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the really interesting question. I think, obviously, what the Kremlin is looking to avoid is what we've seen in Belarus, where a domestic election has had such major consequences for foreign relations and really the relationship of the entire world toward the regime. The paradox is, of course, that all of the steps that Russia has taken against Navalny's organizations to basically make these elections as uneventful as possible, it's almost front-loaded the international response, if you will. Basically, the U.S. has already, starting last year, put all kinds of sanctions on Russian officials in relation to the Navalny incident and the repression of political forces, and made all kinds of statements, of course, regarding repressions against free media, etc. And so basically, a lot of the Western international response has been front-loaded. It doesn't seem likely to me that there's going to be a lot of stomach in Western capitals really put a lot of consequences on Russia for this election, despite it being arguably kind of the most fraudulent and rigged and pre-decided of any that we've seen in Russia in a long time. So I think that a lot of Western governments are probably going to be inclined to stick to statements decrying the fraud and falsifications, but falling short of not recognizing the election. And basically, the idea being that we can't really continue to put sanctions on Russia over this, particularly if we have all of these other issues on our plates. First and foremost, the ongoing crisis in Belarus, and then even more strategic concerns like the rise of China. There's just not a lot of stomach to make the election itself kind of a trigger for increased escalation with Russia.
Matthew Orr is a Stratfor Eurasia analyst at RANE. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Emily. It was a pleasure to be here.
Stay ahead of Russia's political decisions and how they contribute to global geopolitics. Sign up today for the free Worldview newsletter from RANE. Find out more at worldview.stratfor.com. That's worldview.stratfor.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.